Oh, David Suzuki, he's a national treasure. Just ask him. He's an environmental extremist, and that's fine. I mean, it's a free country. He's not an expert in global warming. He used to be a fruit fly geneticist, which is about as related to global warming as being a bricklayer is, but that's fine, too. I mean, you don't need to be a PhD to have an opinion about things. And that's what David Suzuki is, a pundit with an opinion. Here's his opinions on fruit flies, his area of expertise, for example.
Most people in the world are content to stay as first or second level maggots, and they establish their own little area, and they crawl around there, and that's fine. And the guys that become 10th level maggots are really big wheels.
So we're all maggots, and the big shots are the big maggots. Suzuki doesn't talk a lot about maggots these days. Not enough money in it. He aims for the big dollars now, the theory of man-made global warming being the biggest, but he still dresses up his personal opinions as science, just like his crazy talk about people being like maggots. And he pursues his political agenda using public resources, like the CBC, which has given him a propaganda outlet for decades, and the National Film Board, too. But hey, again, free country. Well, I mean, I guess not quite free. You can turn the channel when David Suzuki comes on TV, but you can't escape paying for him because the CBC gets $1.1 billion a year in corporate bailouts from taxpayers, and the National Film Board gets government money, too. So even if you disagree with Suzuki's opinions, you still have to pay for them. But even if you turn off the TV when Suzuki comes on, your children can't avoid his propaganda, because Suzuki has teamed up with the government in the form of that National Film Board to have mass propaganda sessions right inside government schools. Remember, we did a whole expose on that last year. Here's a couple of film clips from that mass indoctrination session.
It was our great industrial development using fossil fuels that had added too much carbon to the atmosphere. The poor countries, their use of fossil fuels is negligible. It's very tiny.
Well, that's a lie right there. He says the poor countries, their greenhouse gases and fossil fuel use is negligible. Not true. That's misrepresenting the facts about China. China is actually the biggest emitter of greenhouse gases in the world. They're building 2 new coal-fired power plants every week. I mean, I don't mind much, but Suzuki claims to be a scientist. He's pretty quick to greenwash China for some reason. Maybe it's because some of his biggest corporate donors these days do big business in China, and it would be embarrassing for Suzuki to mention it. Oh, well. What? Did you think Suzuki was a scientist? No, I told you, he's a propagandist. Here's Suzuki at that same school propaganda session explaining why he likes to talk to kids.
We need to educate children, and we need those educated children to influence their parents. Now, of course, we have been since 19...
So propagandize the children to get to their parents. So it's not science, it's propaganda, getting kids to lobby their parents. That's David Suzuki. But even that isn't the full story. You see, David Suzuki doesn't just lobby kids and people who watch the CBC, he lobbies our government too. In fact, fully 15 of David Suzuki's staff are officially paid lobbyists who have to disclose that to Canada's lobbying commissioner. Here's a picture of their entry on the government's website for lobbyists. It's huge. You've got to scan all the way down. 15 paid lobbyists. I didn't say scientists, I said lobbyists. That's David Suzuki. He holds himself out to the world to be a saint, but he is actually a corporation, a $9 million a year corporation. Here's his annual report from last year, almost $9 million in fundraising. Now, good for him. He's done quite well for himself. He's a jet setter with multiple homes and a 5-star lifestyle. He's earned it. He might not quite live up to his reduce, reuse, recycle argument, but he's a saint. He has more important things to do than to travel on a bicycle or live in a small apartment. He's too important for that. But here's a question. Why does David Suzuki Incorporated, his TV shows, his classroom propaganda, his lobbying, his autobiographical DVDs, his speaking engagements, why is that $9 million a year business called a charity? I mean, a media company, sure, but the Sun's a media company. We're not a charity. It's a company. David Suzuki is a CBC personality, sure, but so is Peter Mansbridge. He can't issue charitable receipts. There are lots of registered lobbyists in Canada, too, like, I don't know, registered arms dealers trying to sell our government fighter jets. But they're not charities like Suzuki. David Suzuki is running all of these businesses, but issuing charitable receipts for them. And you know, I think they're getting a little bit nervous over at Suzuki World Headquarters. Here's my proof. David Suzuki himself is not subject to access to information laws, but some of the government agencies that give him our tax money are. And so looking at the communications between Suzuki's charitable staff and those government agencies is a fascinating glimpse inside the mind of Canada's leading green businessmen of fortune. So here's a glimpse. Remember when we did a show on Suzuki's Propaganda Hour in the schools? We showed you a few clips just a moment ago. Well, Suzuki's corporate team had a freak out about my show, a total meltdown. They wrote to the National Film Board that had paid for the whole thing with your tax money. Here's a letter right here. It's a note from Leanne Claire in the Suzuki Foundation's Ottawa command post. The day after our show here on The Source exposing Suzuki's propaganda, Claire sent a high priority email to the National Film Board. She says, quote, "Did you see the latest piece done by you-know-who yesterday? I'd like to give you a call right now about it. I'm at home right now." Total panic. She was at home, but she wanted to make the call immediately because you-know-who had talked about saying Suzuki. They're so scared of scrutiny over at the Suzuki World Headquarters, they won't even utter my name. It's like Harry Potter, where they don't dare say the name of Voldemort, the bad guy. Look, I'm not as handsome as Voldemort is, but I do have more hair. Anyways, Christine Collins, who works for the Canadian government, paid for by tax dollars at the National Film Board, wrote right back to Suzuki staff. And she said, and look at this, here's a clip from her email. She wrote, "Just saw it. Disaster." Disaster? What's a disaster about it? Was it my commentary? My commentary's not a disaster. My opinion is either something you agree with or you don't agree with. It's never a disaster. My commentary can be ignored. My commentary is a matter of taste. But what was a disaster, I agree, is that for the first time in memory, David Suzuki and his mega corporation were subject to some scrutiny. Instead of just the usual loving stenography given to him by the press gallery, especially his friends at the CBC, the raw footage of David Suzuki propagandizing in the classroom and the email evidence of how Suzuki was insisting on being paid for his propaganda DVDs, that's the disaster. Because that's not a matter of opinion. It's a matter of fact. That's the fact that David Suzuki is not a saint, but rather a cunning businessman who has gamed the system, has learned how to wring maximum money out of the government, and here's the best part, how to collect money through a charitable organization, all for lobbying kids with a partisan agenda. That's the disaster for them. Well, Leanne Claire of the Suzuki Foundation couldn't agree more. She wanted to set up an emergency meeting in an emergency way. Here's her email, quote, "Is there any way for Tom to speak with Peter today, please? Oh, how about tomorrow? Crisis, crisis." Hey, David Suzuki, if you don't want to be criticized, don't take your propaganda into schools and bill the taxpayers for it. But I've got some new news today. I mean, we've talked about how David Suzuki takes millions of dollars in foreign funding every year, and we've shown how he goes soft on foreign polluters like China. But how about actually taking money from foreign governments? I mean, David Suzuki is a Canadian hero, isn't he? I mean, he's on the CBC, so he must be speaking for our national interest, right? I mean, even though he takes foreign money, well, he's still doing what's best for Canada, right? Right? Well, here's the thing. The government of Canada isn't the only government that has an access to information law. So does the United Kingdom. And David Suzuki's foundation has lobbied that foreign government for money in return for pursuing that foreign country's objectives here in Canada. Let me say that again. David Suzuki and his Canadian charity approached a foreign government and offered to work on their behalf to pursue foreign objectives here in Canada, including changing Canadian policies and lobbying our politicians. Hang on. Don't foreign countries already have their own lobbyists here, called diplomats in embassies? Isn't that the job of foreign countries, to make their own case to our government? Isn't it the job of Canadian charities to pursue Canadian charitable ends, not do the bidding of foreigners? I mean, don't get me wrong, I quite like the United Kingdom. I love and am loyal to our mutual Queen, Elizabeth. But the lobbying here was not by the Queen, not by the state, but by the government, which is different. It was a grubby UK politician who paid money to lobby our grubby Canadian politicians, and that is a dirty business in which Canadian charities ought to have no part. I wonder if any other countries have hired Suzuki as their local lobbyist. Who else is against the Canadian oil sands? Too bad Saudi Arabia and Iran don't have access to information laws. I'd check to see if they were donors to Suzuki too. Now here's how grateful the foreign government of the United Kingdom was to David Suzuki and his 15 registered lobbyists. Here's a letter written from the UK government to Suzuki's company. This one is asking for a report from Suzuki to their foreign paymasters, asking for more details on Suzuki's lobbying progress. Here it is. Quote, "Help us convey to London and other colleagues how the DSF, that's the David Suzuki Foundation, is helping, let me do it in an accent, helping take forward the UK's climate change and low carbon initiatives in Canada. I should bring in Michael Corrin to read this. We would be keen to hear about any emerging policy decisions or documents that reflect what the DSF is pushing for, as those would be excellent indicators of impact. Did you get that? How is Suzuki helping to meet the UK's objectives for Canada? Not for how Suzuki is meeting Canada's objectives, but how they're doing for foreign meddlers, for foreign competitors. So we have our foreign ministry negotiating with the UK foreign ministry. But the UK has also hired a mercenary doing their bidding on the ground here named David Suzuki, right in the bosom of the CBC. Bloody brilliant, as the old chaps might say. But you know how those Brits can be, such sticklers for details, so Anglo that way. So when Suzuki asked for a payment of $30,000, the Brits asked very nicely for a detailed accounting. Here's what they wrote to Suzuki. We need much more detailed breakdown of how the $30,000 will be spent, including how much by when. Also, how much staff time can be bought and what exactly would be delivered by each member of staff. What influence will there be on, I can't even keep that up, sorry, on business or provincial or federal government? Okay, look at that language. Forget my accent. How much staff time can be bought? Not for research, not for education, for lobbying to influence the Canadian government. So a registered Canadian charity with tax status according only to truly charitable works like, I don't know, research or hospitals or relieving the poor is now a business agent for a foreign government. A registered lobbying firm with 15 registered lobbyists that now sells its time by the hour to foreign governments with the deliverable result of changing the Canadian government's policy to reflect Canadian objectives a little bit less and to reflect British objectives a little bit more. Huh. Oh yeah, Claire, that is a disaster. No, not my commentary. The problem, Claire, is that you and David are running a business and calling it a charity. You are running a political lobby group and calling it a charity. You are selling your time by the hour to the highest foreign bidder and calling it a charity. Oh, and David, you're an outright partisan hack. Yeah. You think we forgot about this one? Roll the ad.
I think that what Mr. McGuinty has done is to show real leadership and begin Ontario onto a path that will encourage more and more renewable energy to come in. And I happen to applaud the future that he's aiming us into.
That is David Suzuki of the CBC, of the David Suzuki Foundation charity, officially campaigning for the partisan Liberal Party of Ontario in an election. That's partisan campaigning. You're not allowed to do that if you're a charity. It's illegal. It's against the law. That's bad enough. But I've got a disastrous question for you, David. When you were campaigning in that Ontario election, which foreign government's objectives were you serving? Was that part of your work for a foreign interest? Now, I don't know who David Suzuki serves other than himself and his millionaire lifestyle, but I know one thing. David Suzuki sure as hell doesn't serve any Canadian charitable objectives, and it's time the Canada Revenue Agency woke up and stopped being taken to the cleaners by Suzuki's lobby firm.